In the months that followed, the plains continued to change. Flowers bloomed longer. The winters grew softer. Streams ran clear and cold. The soil itself seemed to radiate warmth, even under frost. Satellite images showed faint halos of light around the old lodge sites, rings of thermal energy so subtle they could only be seen from space. The scientists continued to measure. The people continued to listen. The hum never returned in sound. It had moved into them. Now when the wind passes across the grass, it carries a rhythm so subtle that only the heart perceives it. The old songs are sung again, not in ceremonies, but in everyday work, in the sound of hammers, in the rhythm of weaving, in the pulse of feet on soil. The builders live on not as legend, but as motion, as continuity. Every storm that crosses the plains now follows the same pattern, spiraling, circling, folding upon itself. The lightning no longer strikes at random. It maps the land in lines of light, tracing the ancient architecture hidden below. Travelers watching from airplanes describe seeing circles glowing faintly through the clouds, vast and symmetrical, appearing for only an instant before dissolving into mist. And somewhere below in the deep layers of soil, where light never reaches the hum, continues, not as sound, but as memory. The last words of the documentary come not from a narrator, but from the rhythm itself, the sound of the plains, endless living breathing. The camera pulls back, rising above the horizon until the world below becomes a pattern of rings and rivers, light and shadow, motion and stillness. The Great Plains stretch outward like an immense drum, its skin taut with history, its pulse eternal. And then the image dissolves. The screen fades to black. The sound remains. Low, deep, endless. The heartbeat of the earth, the song of the builders, the breath of the world remembering itself. When the storm passes, when the hum fades, all that's left is the echo. But echoes never die. They only find new voices. What will your echo sound like generations from now? Leave your thoughts below. The future might be reading. Every land has a story, but few are told by the land itself. The Great Plains were once filled with builders who shaped silence into home. Before we step into their world, comment below. If your homeland could speak, what truth do you think it would tell? The wind crosses the plains like a memory that refuses to die. It moves through the grass, hissing low, and carries the faint echo of drums that once commanded the sky. In that open land, the Great Plains' endless, wild, untamed silence is never complete. Beneath every step lies the breath of those who walked before. And if you listen long enough, if you let the sound of the wind fill your chest, you can almost hear the rhythm of hooves, the thunder of nations that once ruled this sea of grass. The year is 1842. The horizon burns gold at dawn and fades to ash by dusk. Smoke rises from scattered camps where men once painted their faces for war. Now they paint symbols of protection on the wooden beams of half-built shelters. Once they carried spears, now they carve wood. Once they followed the herds, now they build fences to keep what little remains. The transformation is quiet, almost sacred, and yet beneath it there's an ache, the ache of memory refusing to yield. Somewhere near the banks of the Platte River, an old warrior kneels in the grass. His hands, scarred from years of battle, are now coated in clay and wood dust. He presses a stone tool into the grain of timber, slowly shaping it into a frame for his family's home. The same strength that once held a spear now guides the rhythm of creation. His son watches, silent, eyes wide. The boy does not remember war, only the building, only the sound of wood striking wood, like distant drums returning in a gentler form. The wind picks up again, carrying the whisper of a song, an old Lakota chant once sung before battle. But now, it's softer, slower, a prayer for rain, for soil, for life. The chant moves like a spirit through the camp, weaving between the half-built lodges, over the drying hides, past the elders' fire. It becomes part of the land itself, an echo of the past, reshaped for survival. In the distance, a wagon creaks, a trader's caravan from St. Louis, rolling slow across the horizon. The rumble of its wheels feels like a foreign pulse beating into the old land. The nations of the plains can feel it. Change is coming, not as a single battle, but as a quiet storm that never stops. The warrior looks up from his work and watches the wagon vanish into the haze. He feels the same wind that once carried the scent of war, now filled with the dust of foreign iron and strange voices. And in his heart, something shifts, a knowing that the days of open riding are slipping away. He drives his spear into the ground beside the wooden frame, marking it not as a weapon, but as a boundary. This is where his people will try to live. This is where they will fight a different kind of war, not against armies, but against forgetting. The earth holds the story. Layers of soil and ash still remember the camps that came before the fires that burned when the buffalo roamed in endless herds. Beneath the surface lie bones, fragments of pottery, the carbon ghosts of fires long gone. Archaeologists a century later would find them the silent testimonies of a people rebuilding. Each layer tells a story of resistance not through conquest but through endurance. In the oral traditions of the Lakota, there is a story about the time the land asked for patience. It tells of a spirit that walked the plains after the last great war, carrying no weapon, only a feather and a bowl of water. The spirit visited each camp saying, "Those who strike will vanish, those who build will remain." Some laughed thinking it a tale for children, but others listened. They began to build small lodges with stronger frames. They began to trade to men to plant. They began to live differently, as if the land itself had whispered a new way of surviving. But the ghosts of the old warriors did not leave easily. They lingered in the wind in the cracks of old shields now hung as ornaments in the faint marks carved into the walls of newly built huts. At night, when the fire dies and the wind moans, some claim to see the outlines of riders moving across the moonlit hills, shadows of a life that refuses to fade. The narrator's voice deepens. The rhythm slows. "This is not a story about conquest," he says. "It is about what comes after when the thunder fades and the silence begins. It is about the moment a people looked at the ruins of their old world and decided to build instead of burn." The screen fills with wide shots of the Great Plains, the sky vast and merciless, the ground breathing under the light. The camera drifts over remnants, a broken wagon wheel, a child's toy carved from bone, a wooden beam half buried in the dirt. Over it, a woman's voice hums a lullaby in Lakota, a melody older than the borders that would soon carve her people's land apart. In one frame, we see an elder placing a hand against the earth. His lips move in prayer, his eyes closed. He is speaking to the soil, the same soil that once held his ancestors' footprints and now holds the foundations of his children's homes. The wind bends the grass around him, and in that movement there is a sense of something sacred, a continuity that even time cannot sever. The cold hook lingers not in chaos but in contrast, the transformation of a land once drenched in war into a space of quiet rebuilding. The drums of battle replaced by the rhythm of work, the chants of warriors reborn as songs of labor. And yet in every heartbeat of that silence, the ghosts of the old ways still whisper warning that peace too has its cost. The narrator continues, voice low, almost a confession. In 1842, the nations of the plains stood at the edge of two worlds, one fading into dust, the other still being built. This is where we begin, in the wind between the ashes of the past and the timber of what was yet to come. The screen fades to black. The sound of the wind remains steady, eternal, unbroken. And somewhere, faintly, the echo of a hammer striking wood. Steady as a heartbeat, steady as survival. The dawn rises slow over the Great Plains, not with fanfare, but with the solemn breath of a world too vast to be hurried. The horizon burns with soft gold, stretching across an ocean of grass that moves like waves beneath the first wind of morning. Each blade glints with dew, each shadow curls and vanishes as the sun climbs higher. The land seems eternal, but in 1842, nothing here is truly still. Beneath this serene expanse, a transformation is taking place, quiet, painful, inevitable. The Great Plains, a stretch of land spanning from the Missouri to the Rockies, from Texas to the Saskatchewan, was once a wilderness untouched by fences or iron. It was a world of motion. The people of the plains, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Comanche, the Kiowa, lived as the herds moved their lives, guided by the great migrations of the buffalo. But by 1842, that rhythm had begun to falter. The earth itself felt different. Fewer hooves, fewer drums. New tracks cut into the land, the trails of wagons, the rumble of commerce, the whisper of something foreign. The sun catches on a trail of dust traders moving west from St. Louis, loaded with rifles, kettles, blankets dyed in colors the plains had never known. They cross rivers where old hunting camps once stood, leaving behind empty ashes where children once played. The Plains nations had seen outsiders before, explorers, missionaries, soldiers, but this new wave felt different. It did not come with war banners. It came with barter, with paper, with promises written in tongues the wind could not read. Along the Platte River, settlements begin to flicker like sparks, forts built of timber and stone. Fort Laramie, Bent's Fort, trading posts that were meant to be temporary, but soon grew roots anchoring themselves into the soil like invasive trees. Around them, life changes. The warriors who once raided the Pawnee for horses now trade beaver pelts for guns. Women sew hides for canvas in exchange for flour and salt. The children learn new words: iron, whiskey, money. The old songs still echo, but quieter now, tangled with the sounds of hammers and creaking wagon wheels. In the midst of this change, the seasons carry stories. The winter of 1841 was long and bitter. The herds moved south, the rivers froze early, and hunger crawled into every camp. By spring, many realized that hunting alone could no longer sustain them. The elders gathered around the fires and debated the signs. Some said it was punishment, the spirits angry at how the young had forgotten the old dances. Others said it was simply time the turning of the Great Circle, the land asking for something new. And so they began to build. The first lodges were awkward things, half wood, half hide, shaped by hands that had never built with timber before. But they stood. And in standing, they became symbols of endurance. Each beam carried a prayer, each stone a story. Some were raised near rivers, others by the edges of old camps. To outsiders, they looked like crude attempts at settlement, but to those who built them, they were shrines, acts of defiance against disappearance. The voiceover softens. In every plank of wood, it says there is grief, and in every nail, a choice to remain. The camera glides low across the grass. The viewer sees traces of life, a ring of stones once used for fire, fragments of bone beads, a child's toy carved into the shape of a buffalo. Each fragment hums with continuity. These are not ruins, they are the fingerprints of survival. Historical records, the journals of fur traders, army engineers, missionaries, capture the same landscape, but never the spirit. One trader writes in his 1842 logbook, "The Sioux are changing their manner of living. I have seen them build houses of timber near the river. They trade for nails and axes. They say they will plant. He calls it progress." But between his lines, something else bleeds through: confusion, even fear. For if the Sioux build houses, what becomes of the wilderness that defines them? What becomes of the frontier when those who once rode against it begin to shape it? To the tribes, the transformation was not surrender, it was adaptation, a quiet kind of resistance, survival through creation. The spirit of the warrior remained, only its weapon had changed. Some nights, the fire still burned bright across the hills. The people gathered in circles, drums low and steady songs old as the stars. The elders recited the tales of the first builders' stories passed through generations, about a time before the great migrations, when the people lived close to rivers and knew how to shape the earth. They spoke of the return of that age, the prophecy of the returning hands, when warriors would lay down their weapons and rebuild what was lost. The folklore deepens here, an invisible undercurrent beneath the factual timeline. Some say a spirit walked the plains during this time, neither man nor ghost carrying two objects, a broken spear and a carved beam of wood. He would visit camps in the night, placing the wooden beam beside the sleeping and whispering, "The land remembers your touch." When the people awoke, they found the beam turned to stone, a sign, they said, that the earth wanted their hands, not their blood. Anthropologists in the 20th century would dismiss such stories as allegory, a myth created to explain social change. But among the descendants of those who built in 1842, the story is still told. They call the spirit he who binds the land. His name is whispered when new homes are built, when a beam is raised or a post driven into the soil. For them, myth and history are not separate. They are threads of the same cloth, one seen, one felt. The film pans over a vast map, rivers drawn in dark ink, tribal territories, marked by dotted lines that shift year after year. The narrator's tone grows heavier. By 1842, the Great Plains were no longer the untouched heart of the continent. It was a crossroads. Traders from the east, hunters from the north, settlers from the south, soldiers from the west, and in between the nations who had lived here for 1,000 years, forced to reshape their lives in the space left between other people's roads. The tension of that reality hums beneath every scene. You can feel it in the air, the collision of old and new, of myth and iron. The buffalo trails cross paths with wagon tracks. Sacred sites become landmarks on maps written in another language. Even the sky seems to hold its breath, as if unsure which world it belongs to. A Lakota oral historian speaking nearly a century later would describe this time as the age when the songs forgot their words. He said the people still sang, still danced, still prayed, but something in the air had changed. The echoes of their ancestors were being drowned out by the metallic clatter of a world that could not hear them. The documentary lingers on a single image: a young boy running through tall grass chasing the shadow of a bird. He carries a small wooden toy carved by his father from an old spear handle. The camera follows him until he disappears into the horizon. The narrator whispers, "The child plays where his father once fought." That is the story of this land. Time passes through montage: winter, spring, summer, snow sweeping across the plains, rivers thawing, grass returning in waves. Each season reshapes the landscape, and with it, the people. In 1842, the Great Plains are both a home and a test. The sky gives and takes in equal measure. To live here is to live in negotiation with the elements, with hunger, with the ghosts of one's own ancestors. The factual layer reemerges. Trade routes extend deeper into the heartland. Bent's Fort becomes a hub of commerce. The Missouri fur trade peaks. The U.S. government begins surveying routes for what would become the Oregon Trail. None of these seem like wars, and yet they move like armies carving invisible front lines through ancestral lands. Diplomacy becomes as dangerous as battle. The treaties signed in this decade will later unravel entire nations. But in 1842, those who live through it do not see the future. They see only the day, the next hunt, the next storm. They build because they must. They build because creation, however fragile, is the only way to stay alive. As the camera pans across the plains at dusk, the narrator's voice lowers again. The horizon looks endless, but in every direction, walls are forming. Wood and iron, invisible, it does not matter. They will close in all the same. But for now, the people still have the sky, the river, the wind, and the will to shape them into a home. The last image of this section is simple, a single wooden beam upright in the earth, casting a long shadow across the grass. It stands like a sentinel, neither monument nor ruin, but a promise. Behind it, the light fades and the wind hums through the plains like a prayer returning to the soil. Plains in spring do not wake all at once. They breathe slowly, the frost withdrawing from the soil, the grass rising like smoke. It is a kind of resurrection. But in 1842, that resurrection feels different. The air carries a restlessness that the elders cannot name. The buffalo herds, once so vast they seemed eternal, are late to arrive. The sky, always a ceiling of motion, stands still. Hunters return empty-handed. Fires burn smaller. The people listen for the drums of migration that never come. And then the sound changes. No longer the rhythm of hooves, but the rhythm of wood against wood. A dull, steady heartbeat spreading across the grasslands. It begins in one camp, then another. By summer, it echoes along the Platte, the Arkansas, the Niobrara. The plains once ruled by movement, now hum with construction. It begins with necessity. The winters have grown crueler. The traders who once came and went now stay through the seasons bringing tools, nails, and saws. The buffalo trails grow thinner, and the rivers change course with the storms. The people cannot live as they once did. But beneath that necessity lies something else, a realization whispered in the language of survival. That to remain is not to surrender, but to claim the land anew. The first homes rise quietly, almost shyly from the horizon. Timber beams stripped of bark lashed with sinew, and rope covered in hide and clay. The smell of wet earth mixes with wood smoke. Children run barefoot through the building sites, carrying stones, reeds, feathers. Women sing to the rhythm of their work voices rising and falling with the swing of the hammers. The songs are not prayers to any god. Not yet. They are lullabies for a world being rebuilt. In the evenings, when the sun bleeds into the western sky, the camps glow like embers scattered across the prairie. The men sit outside their half-finished lodges, sharpening tools carved from old spearheads. Their hands still remember the motion of war, but their muscles learn the patience of creation. They look toward the horizon and see not enemies, but weather, the true test of endurance. One elder remembered in oral histories as chasing iron becomes the quiet symbol of this new age. He fought in every campaign of his youth, against Pawnee, against Crow, against hunger itself. His scars tell stories that have outlived every battle. Now his weapon is a carving blade. Each morning he works in silence, shaping beams from the trees along the riverbank. His sons mock him. At first the great warrior turned carpenter, but as they watch his hands steady as prayer, something in them shifts. The old man's labor feels sacred. Each strike of his tool sounds like the echo of drums from a forgotten age. By midsummer, the shape of his new home rises from the earth, 4 great posts sunk deep into the ground, facing the cardinal directions. Inside the smoke hole aligns with the morning sun. The house is more than shelter. It is geometry, philosophy, memory made solid. When the frame stands complete, he drives his old spear into the soil beside it. The spear does not mark victory nor surrender. It marks the boundary between what was and what will be. The transformation is not isolated. Across hundreds of miles from Dakota to Colorado, similar structures appear. Some are circular, built from cottonwood poles covered in clay. Others are rectangular with roofs of woven grass and bison hide. In every case, the builders face east toward dawn. The symbolism is universal to greet the rising light to begin again. The landscape itself begins to change. Camps that once vanished with the seasons now remain year-round. Paths become roads. Roads become memory. Traders take note. They begin sketching maps that show the Indian villages as permanent features, dots on a page that can no longer be erased with the passing of a season. Inside one such camp near the forks of the Loup River, a woman named Running Water keeps a record of her own, not in words, but in patterns. On a long strip of leather, she carves small symbols, a circle for each new home built that year, a line for each storm that tested them. The leather becomes her family's story, a map of endurance. She buries it in the floor of her lodge when the first snow comes, believing that the earth will remember what paper cannot. The world of the builders grows complex. The days of single-purpose warriors give way to craftsmen, healers, traders, and dreamers. Men once known for their ferocity on horseback become teachers of woodcraft. Children learn the sound of the river as a guide for planting. Women lead the gatherings of design marking, where each new home should face how the walls should curve to catch the wind, but not break against it. They do not call this architecture, they call it listening. Even the ceremonies change. When the people gather for the Sundance that summer, the center pole once chosen from the tallest tree is now surrounded by beams from new homes. Each builder brings a small piece of his work to offer. As the drums sound, the circle feels different. The prayers are no longer only for victory, but for endurance, for balance, for the chance to see another spring. And yet beneath all this creation, something uneasy stirs. The traders speak of new roads, paths of wagons stretching toward Oregon, cutting through the heart of the plains. They say, more forts will come, more soldiers. The elders know what that means. They have seen the map's paper worlds where their rivers are just blue lines, their homes small dots labeled temporary. They sense that this rebirth is also a race against time. But the people keep building. To stop would be to die before death arrives. As autumn settles, the first great storm of the year rolls over the plains. Thunder walks across the horizon. Rain falls like stones. The newly built homes are tested. Some collapse, others stand. And when the wind finally stills, those who survive gather in the mud and rebuild again and again. The land is a teacher that does not spare its students. There are stories told afterward, stories of lights seen above the camps during the storm, glowing blue and white, dancing along the rooftops. Some say they were spirits inspecting the work of the living. Others say they were simply fire from the sky. But for those who saw them, the meaning is the same the earth has noticed. The ancestors are watching. Winter 1842 arrives hard and early. Snow buries the grass to the height of a horse's flank. The rivers freeze. Inside the lodges, fires burn low. Food runs short. But unlike winters past, the homes do not fall. The clay walls hold firm. The roofs do not tear. Children sleep without frost on their lips. When the sun returns, it finds the camp still standing, weary but alive. That survival becomes legend. They call it the winter that did not win. And with it comes pride, not the pride of conquest, but of endurance. The people have learned that the land can be shaped without being broken. They have learned that creation itself can be an act of war, not against enemies, but against oblivion. By spring, new songs are born. They tell of builders who turn their hands to the soil and their eyes to the wind. They describe the wood as a living being, a spirit that remembers every touch, every storm. The songs spread across the plains, carried by traders, travelers, and storytellers. Even those who still wander begin to hum them. And somewhere in that melody, the sound of the old world and the new becomes one. In the decades to come, archaeologists would find traces of this time. The bones of lodges near rivers, post holes aligned with the solstice sun, fragments of tools dulled by years of use. They would call it transition. But for those who lived it, it was survival written into the soil. The camera drifts over the plains as they are now vast, gold, and empty. Nothing moves except the grass. But beneath the surface lies another world, the buried frames of old homes, the ash of ancient fires, the breath of those who once sang while they worked. The wind carries their rhythm, still faint but insistent. It is said that on certain nights when the moon is full and the air turns cold, you can hear that rhythm again, a low, steady pulse under the sound of the wind. Not a drum, not a heartbeat. The sound of hammers on wood, the echo of a people who chose to build instead of vanish. The plains remember everything. The plains had begun to remember what still lived upon them. When the first homes were raised, when the old spears were pressed into the ground like prayers, the wind seemed to pause as though it were listening. But the earth never allows stillness for long. It tests what it is asked to hold. By the spring of 1843, a year after the first beams were lifted, that test had begun, slow, strange, and unstoppable. The thaw that year was unlike any the people had seen. Rivers broke their banks, flooding through valleys that had been dry for decades. The ice didn't melt. It split apart with a sound like bone breaking, sending shards drifting downstream. Hunters spoke of herds that turned away from the water, as if afraid of what it carried. In the night, the new homes groaned under the weight of sodden clay. The sound of dripping water filled every dream. To the builders, this was not simply weather. It was the land's first whisper, an inquiry, perhaps a warning. They had asked the earth to accept their hands to hold their weight to keep their children. Now the earth replied, "Show me if you deserve it." When the floods receded, they left behind fields coated in a film of black silt, fertile, fragrant, almost oily. The women began to plant there, pressing corn and beans into the softened soil. The shoots rose quickly, unnaturally green. They grew higher than any seen before, but with that abundance came unease. At night, the stalks moved though the wind had died. Some swore they could hear the low hum of a voice in the fields whispering through the rows. Then came the first loss. One morning, a young boy named Lame Bird went missing. He had gone to fetch water from the creek no farther than a few hundred paces from his family's lodge. The bucket was found at the bank overturned. The sand bore his footprints, and another set beside them, wider, deeper, too long for a man, too short for a beast. They led away from the creek into a patch of tall grass and ended abruptly, as though both child and creature had been lifted into the air. The search parties found nothing. The people gathered in silence that night, their fires burning low. An elder named Two Arrows said the boy had been taken back, not in punishment, but as a message. He told them that when the earth accepts a people, it demands something in return. No one argued. The next morning they laid a ring of stones near the creek and carved into one the symbol of a child's hand. No one drank from that place again. The soldiers at the forts heard of it and dismissed it as folklore. They wrote in their ledgers that the tribes had gone superstitious under hunger. Yet in that same month, 2 men from a wagon train vanished along the same river. Their camp remained untouched. Their rifles and food were still there. Their footprints ended at the water's edge, side by side, facing inland. By summer, disappearances were no longer rare. Hunters gone without a trace. Traders who failed to return from routes they had traveled for years. Settlers whose wagons were found empty in the morning. The stories moved faster than the wind across the plains, through the forts, along the rivers, tales of shadows on the horizon that didn't move with the sun of fires seen where no camp stood, of the earth itself swallowing what it did not recognize. Among the builders, fear took shape as ritual. They began to paint their doorways with circles of red clay mixed with ash to mark themselves as children of the soil. They buried feathers under the thresholds of their homes, believing that the wind would recognize the mark and pass them by. When storms rolled across the horizon, they stood outside, faces raised to the rain, whispering to the clouds to remember them as builders, not destroyers. That summer, the sky darkened earlier than usual. At first, they thought it was a dust storm, one of the brown veils that sometimes swallowed the horizon. But when the wind came, it carried a heat that stung the skin. The air tasted metallic bitter. Then lightning fell not from the clouds, but from the ground upward, streaking into the sky in bolts of blue-white fire. The people fled into their homes, holding the walls with both hands, as if their bodies could anchor them. The storm raged for hours, tearing roofs, uprooting poles, flooding the plains with blinding rain. When dawn returned, the fields were flattened. The corn was gone. The shrines at the edges of the camp had been overturned, but in the center of the village, one lodge stood untouched, the House of Chasing Iron. His spear, still driven into the ground beside it, was blackened but intact. The survivors gathered around it, saying that the spear had spoken to the storm, that the wind had remembered who it belonged to. Far to the east, travelers on the Platte reported seeing a pillar of light rising from the horizon during the same storm, blue, steady, humming like a living thing. No one could explain it. A missionary wrote of it in his diary, describing it as a sign from heaven, or perhaps something older than heaven. When the sun set that evening, the plains seemed changed. The grass gleamed silver in the fading light, as if dusted with ash. The air smelled of iron. The people felt watched. Over the next months, the land itself began to move strangely. The buffalo, what few remained, avoided the old paths, their herds turning east instead of north. Coyotes appeared in packs that followed the edges of the villages but never entered. Birds flew in patterns that made no sense, circling low over the camps, before vanishing south. The rhythm of the plains, the natural order that had guided life for centuries, was breaking. To the soldiers and settlers, these were curiosities. To the builders, they were messages. The elders gathered the people and said, "The land speaks because we have made it remember, but it remembers everything, even the wars." And indeed, some said they began to see figures in the night riders, without horses, walking in lines along the ridges, flickering in and out of the mist. Shapes that resembled warriors of the old days, moving silently beneath the moon, their faces hidden behind veils of smoke. Those who saw them said they carried torches made from bone that gave no light, only heat. They never attacked, never spoke, only watched and disappeared at dawn. The young grew restless. Some wanted to leave to return to the nomadic life. Others believed leaving would mean the earth would forget them again, and that forgetting was worse than death. So, they stayed. They built more shrines, sang louder at night, told longer stories to the children. They tried to fill the silence with sound, but the wind always carried it away. As autumn approached, the plains grew darker. The sky no longer burned gold at sunset. It dimmed to a strange purple haze that made the air shimmer. The rivers ran lower than ever before, their surfaces smooth as mirrors. When the people looked into them, they claimed the reflections didn't match. The faces looking back were older, their eyes hollow, as though the river was showing not who they were, but who they would become. Hunger followed. The corn failed. The herds did not return. The traders charged double for flour and salt, and even they seemed nervous now. their voices lower, their eyes darting to the horizon. One spoke of hearing singing in the hills, a deep harmonic sound like hundreds of voices chanting under the earth. Another swore he saw light glowing beneath the ground, on the darkest nights, faint but steady, like lanterns buried deep. Then came the disappearance that would seal the legend of that year. In a settlement near the Niobrara River, 50 families had built together their homes, arranged in a great spiral all facing inward. They called it the Circle of the Winds. It was the largest of all the new communities, proud, organized, filled with the sense that they had finally found balance. One morning in late autumn, a messenger arrived from a neighboring tribe bringing news of traders traveling east. He found the circle silent. The lodges still stood, fires still burned in their pits, pots of food still simmered, tools lay neatly in rows, but there was no one there, not a body, not a footprint, only the wind moving through the open doors. When others came to search, they found something else, a perfect ring of stones surrounding the settlement, each carved with the same spiral symbol used in the old warrior shields. But these spirals faced inward, as if enclosing rather than protecting. And in the very center of the camp stood a single post taller than any man, wrapped in hide and feathers, its surface scorched black. They called it the Pillar of the Vanished. No one dared touch it. The traders reported it to the forts, but the soldiers who went to investigate could not find the place. The coordinates didn't match. The ground where the circle had stood was now flat and empty, covered in a strange layer of ash. Even the grass refused to grow there. Years later, surveyors who mapped the plains found the same patch of land barren, circular, perfectly silent. They noted it on their charts as no vegetation, cause unknown. The people said otherwise. They said the circle had not been destroyed, only reclaimed. The builders had finished their work and walked into the wind. The spiral was the doorway. The earth had closed it behind them. The narrator's voice grows low, steady, filled with the weight of generations. They built to live. The land built to remember. Between the two came the reckoning storms that broke the horizon, disappearances that no record could explain, and the whispers that still rise when the wind crosses those plains. The camera drifts now over that same horizon, wide and endless. The grass bends as though under invisible footsteps. Distant thunder rolls. The light of dusk glows copper red, casting the land in an almost sacred hue. The voice continues slower, like the plains themselves breathing. What happened between the rivers that year cannot be found in ledgers or treaties. It lives in the soil, in the echo of nails struck into wood, in the way the storms still form without warning, in the way the grass sometimes moves against the wind. The builders changed the land, yes, but in return, the land changed them. Somewhere a hawk circles, the wind rises again, and beneath it all, faint but certain, the sound of hammers returns, rhythmic, defiant, endless. The Great Plains stretch endless under the mid-century sky, a sea of ochre and gold rippling like water under the wind. But by 1845, the land no longer feels like open country. It feels inhabited, conscious, restless. Beneath the grass, something ancient begins to move, not alive in the way flesh lives, but breathing, remembering, rewriting itself. The people who remain the builders sense it first. They have learned to read the air like scripture. Every shift of color in the horizon, every scent of iron or rain carries meaning. The winds from the north come sharper now, as though cutting through memory itself. The winds from the south arrive heavy with heat, thick enough to bend the stalks of corn that still struggle to grow. And somewhere between them lies the story that the world forgot, a story that begins in silence but ends in fire. After the vanishings of 1843, the survivors scattered across the heartland, forming small communities between the rivers. They rebuilt again, always rebuilding out of habit, out of faith, out of fear. The old nomadic circles had become clusters of timber lodges, permanent, unyielding. Smoke rose from their roofs in measured rhythms like a language. They worked without pause. Each post sunk into the ground felt like an oath. Each handful of clay pressed into the wall was an apology to the soil. They believed that if they kept building, if they stayed loyal to the rhythm of creation, the storms would ease and the land would accept them fully. But the storms never stopped. They only changed shape. That spring, the winds carried whispers of something impossible, that the rivers had begun to run backward. Scouts who followed the Platte swore they saw its waters reversing, foam and debris carried against the current. The claim was dismissed by traders as delirium. Yet days later, soldiers mapping the same stretch of river recorded the same phenomenon, a half-day when the flow slowed, paused, and shifted direction before returning to normal. To the builders, this was not madness. It was memory. They said the river was dreaming, retracing its own path, remembering how it once ran before men carved its name into maps. They took it as a sign the land was awake, and it was listening. They answered with ceremony. All through that season, the builders erected what they called speaking posts, tall wooden columns carved with spirals and marks that followed no alphabet. These were placed beside the rivers at the boundaries of each camp. When the wind blew, the posts moaned hollow and deep, carrying sound miles across the plains. They called the sound the earth's breath, and believed it told the rivers that the people still lived, that they had not fled, that their memory was safe. At night, the plains were no longer quiet. The air was full of song, not from voices but from the hollow hum of hundreds of speaking posts vibrating together, rising and falling in tone until it sounded like a single being murmuring under the stars. Travelers from the forts began to fear the sound. Some said it kept them awake for days. Others said it followed them even when they left the prairie, a low droning tone that clung to their dreams. And still more records disappeared. Between 1804 and 1846, correspondence between the forts and Washington thinned to nothing. Crates of maps, journals, and survey notes vanished en route. When new reports were sent, their details contradicted one another, distances too vast. Rivers misplaced coordinates that led to empty plains. An officer named Captain Elias Warner, already known among the builders as the man who listened, wrote in his final dispatch, "Our compasses spin when we cross certain ridges. The river widens and narrows without cause. The locals claim the earth is turning itself inside out, reclaiming what was lent. I believe them." He was last seen standing alone at sunset, drawing circles in the dust with a stick. His men found his footprints leading into the grass, then stopping mid-stride. A year later, a clay jar was uncovered along the riverbank sealed with pitch. Inside was a single page of his handwriting, a sketch of a spiral identical to those on the builders' posts. The builders kept working. By now, their settlements had formed a network stretching hundreds of miles, the largest indigenous reconstruction effort the plains would ever see. They called it the Line of Hands. Each home faced another, each settlement connected by invisible geometry. The design came from dreams, shared dreams that spread from camp to camp, repeating symbols, measurements, alignments. Elders claimed they all saw the same thing when they slept, a map drawn in light, glowing over the earth, lines of energy converging in the center of the plains. They began to call that unseen center the Great Lodge. The story of the Great Lodge would become one of the most enduring legends in the oral histories of the Lakota and Cheyenne. It is said that in 1845, a woman named Hollow Sky dreamed of a house big enough to hold every tribe, every child, every language. A place where the land itself would speak through the wind that passed across its roof. She saw its walls woven from reeds and bone, its beams made from trees that no longer grew, its dome reaching the height of a thunderhead. When she told the dream builders from across the plains began to arrive, Sioux, Arapaho, Mandan, Pawnee. They came carrying woodstone and song. For 2 years they labored, guided not by plans but by the memory of her vision. It is said the lodge rose from the earth as if it had been buried there forever, waiting to be uncovered. Its floor was a mosaic of river stones, shaped like the paths of migrating herds. Its roof opened to the sky through a great round hole lined with copper and clay. When the wind moved through it, the sound was not a whistle, but a voice low, resonant like thunder trapped in the bones of the world. Even the traders who came to barter for food and hides stopped to listen. Some wept. One missionary wrote, "They have built a cathedral without knowing what such a thing is." But the Great Lodge was not built only for shelter. It was built for memory. Inside, the elders placed offerings from each tribe, a handful of soil, a feather, a stone, a piece of red cloth, a bowl of salt. Together they formed a pattern across the floor, a map not of geography, but of belonging. The elders said that when the storms returned, the lodge would remember these things and protect what it knew. When the first snow fell that year, the builders lit fires around the Great Lodge and sang. The sound rose into the sky, carried for miles. Witnesses in distant camps said the flames did not flicker upward, they curled inward, drawn into the center of the structure until the roof itself glowed faintly red. Some swore they saw shapes moving within the light, not human, not spirit, but something vast and patient. The next morning the fires were gone. The air smelled of iron and rain. The grass around the lodge was blackened as if burned by lightning, yet there had been no storm. The year that followed was dry and long. The corn wilted, rivers shrank, the herds did not return. The builders held councils at the Great Lodge, asking the land what it wanted, but the land remained silent. Then one night, Hollow Sky vanished. Her footprints led from her lodge to the entrance of the Great Lodge and stopped at the threshold. The next day, the people entered the structure and found no trace of her, only a pattern of dust spiraling outward from the center of the floor. They called it the Mark of the Listener. After that, the storms returned. They came harder than before, black clouds that crawled across the plains like mountains in motion. The wind was hot, carrying sparks and ash. The homes shook, the rivers boiled, the sky turned green. Inside the Great Lodge, the builders gathered, hundreds of them, families pressed together under the dome. The sound outside was unbearable, the voice of the earth itself tearing and roaring. Then came a flash brighter than daylight, and silence followed. When the storm cleared, the Great Lodge was gone, not destroyed, gone. The ground where it stood was smooth, glassy, scorched in a perfect circle, 100 yards wide. The survivors said they felt the heat in their bones for days after. Some claimed they saw the reflection of the lodge in the sky at dawn, upside down, floating transparent. In the decades that followed, the memory of the Great Lodge became both history and prophecy. The government called it an exaggeration of the native imagination. Scientists who studied the site in the 20th century found fused soil traces of copper and organic material vitrified by heat beyond known fire temperatures. The report concluded the source of this thermal anomaly is unknown. No meteorological evidence of lightning strikes was found. But among the descendants of the builders, the meaning is simpler. The lodge did what it was meant to do. It listened. It spoke back. It took what was given and returned it as memory. By the late 1840s, the U.S. Army began its formal surveys of the plains. They sent engineers, cartographers, ethnographers. They expected resistance war parties, ambushes, the chaos of untamed territory. What they found instead were ruins, villages, half-buried wooden posts rising from the soil like ribs. The soldiers noted something strange. The timbers were charred at the top, not the base as if burned from above. The ground beneath them was magnetized. Compasses spun in circles. They called these fire rings and avoided them during patrols. In the years that followed, settlers reported odd phenomena near the old sites, cattle refusing to graze tools, rusting overnight air so still that sound would not carry. One family building, a homestead near the Platte, dug into the earth and found a layer of blackened stone that rang like metal when struck. They built their house elsewhere. The folklore deepens here, the line between myth and record indistinguishable. Some say the builders never truly vanished, that when the Great Lodge disappeared, it did not burn, it sank. They believe it still lies beneath the plains, its copper roof intact, its fires still burning silently underground. Those who walk over its resting place feel warmth under their feet even in winter. The wind there never stops. Others tell a darker version that the lodge was not taken by the land, but by the sky. That the lightning which fell that night was not storm, but summons that the ancestors of the builders were called home by something greater than the earth itself. Whatever the truth, the story refuses to die. Travelers still report strange lights over the plains, rising from the ground, in spirals fading before dawn. Farmers speak of finding their plows bent in perfect arcs after thunderstorms. Children wake to the sound of low humming under their homes. The elders simply say, "The builders are speaking again." Fact returns thin but undeniable. In 1891, a team of geologists from the Smithsonian surveyed a section of Nebraska plains where compasses failed. They discovered circular magnetic anomalies buried beneath the soil, perfectly symmetrical, 15 meters wide. Their conclusion: metallic ore deposits. But in one core sample, they found a human-made artifact, a fragment of hardened clay with the imprint of a hand. Beneath it, microscopic traces of copper and iron fused together. The pattern matched 19th century native pottery. The site was closed. The findings were filed as inconclusive. But the locals knew where it was. They called it the ground that listens. The camera of the documentary moves across that same land in the present day. The grass ripples like ocean waves under the wind. The sound design builds a layered hum, deep and resonant, mixed with the faint rhythm of hammering far away, impossible to locate. The narrator's voice returns calm, steady, with the gravity of something both human and cosmic. The builders believed that to carve, to shape, to create was to speak to the living world. They did not vanish. They became part of what they built. Their voices are the wind. Their memory is the soil. Their story is the storm that returns each spring. The film cuts to archival sketches, survey maps with circular burn marks, faded journals with missing pages, a drawing of the Great Lodge rendered by a trader who claimed to see it rise from the ground like breath. Then modern drone footage of the plains. The same spirals still faintly visible from above, patterns of grass growth too symmetrical to be natural. As the voice continues, the pace slows. History calls this the frontier, a place of expansion. But for those who built it was the opposite. It was the center of the world, a place where creation and memory merged, where every nail, every beam, every stone whispered the same truth. Nothing ever truly leaves the land that remembers it. The final image fades in a handprint pressed into dried clay, half buried in the dirt, the edges cracked by time. The wind sweeps over it, filling the grooves with dust. As the screen darkens, the hum deepens until it becomes indistinguishable from thunder. The narrator's last line drifts through the sound. The land keeps what is given to it, and the builders, they are still building. The Great Plains hold their breath differently now. The air no longer drifts without purpose. It moves as if following something buried, tracing invisible paths under the soil. Each gust feels heavier, as if carrying the echo of something vast that refuses to rest. The horizon stretches open like a wound that's learned to hide its pain. There are no voices now, no riders, no builders left to be seen, and yet the land hums. You can feel it if you stand still long enough, a pulse beneath your boots, steady, patient, alive. Long after the last lodges collapsed, after the maps were rewritten, and the railroads carved scars across the grass, something remained below, something that waited. Those who built with wood and clay are gone, but the land they shaped never forgot the pattern of their hands. The beams they buried became veins. The posts they drove became roots. Every hammer strike, every footstep was recorded in the skin of the earth, and though centuries passed, the sound never stopped traveling. For generations, no one noticed. The settlers called it wind. The surveyors called it tremor. The geologists called it nothing at all. But every spring when the storms returned to this country, the same things happened. Lightning struck. The same places thunder rolled in the same sequence, and the sky pulsed in rhythm with something below. It wasn't weather, it was memory. They had built in circles every home, every village, every shrine bound by geometry that mirrored the stars. Those circles still exist, invisible to the naked eye, but alive in the electromagnetic pulse of the soil. Satellites would one day see them, faint rings of energy aligned perfectly across hundreds of miles, like the fingerprints of giants. But the builders didn't need machines to know what they had created. They said that when a man works with truth in his heart, the land itself begins to breathe through him. No one believed such things. Not the traders who found compasses spinning uselessly near the old camps, not the missionaries who heard humming under their chapels, not the ranchers whose cattle refused to graze on certain patches of land. They buried what they found, built over it, paved it, forgot it. Yet every nail they drove into the plains echoed the rhythm of those old hammers. The earth took everything, the sound of labor, the weight of sorrow, the vibration of prayer, and folded it into itself like a secret. When the machines of the modern world came, they disturbed that silence. The first was a road crew west of North Platte, men in denim and dust, their machines roaring across ground that had never known engines. Their drills hit something hard, not stone, not metal. When they struck it, the ground sang. The foreman laughed it off as resonance, but that night the men couldn't sleep. Their tents shook without wind. The air inside the camp shimmered. A low hum pressed against their chests like the beat of a distant drum. By dawn, one of them had disappeared. The others found his boots standing neatly by the hole. No footprints led away. The dirt at the edge of the trench was fused to glass. The story spread, and scientists came, geologists, archaeologists, men with clipboards and questions. They found fragments of charred timber, arranged in a perfect ring, and soil burned to vitrified clay. They tested it for radiation. They blamed lightning. But when they stood at the center, their instruments failed. Compasses spun. Film-fogged watches stopped. When the sun hit the fused clay, it reflected light, like water blue shifting alive. Beneath the glassy surface lay something else, thin sheets of copper, engraved with spirals and handprints, each turned inward as if reaching into the ground. The archaeologists recorded everything. They made maps, sketches, notes. Then one by one their files disappeared. The site was fenced off. Within weeks, its name erased from the ledgers. But the wind carried the story back to those who still remembered. Decades later, a woman named Miriam Red Elk, part scientist, part seeker, came searching. Her grandmother had told her that one day the land would speak again and the builder's heartbeat would rise through the soil like thunder. She grew up hearing it in her dreams, the rhythm of hammer and song rising and falling with the wind. When she studied anthropology, she saw the same rhythm hidden in the data, strange magnetic readings, repeating cycles, perfect circles appearing in satellite scans. So she went. She walked the plains with instruments on her back, recording the hum of the earth. At first it was faint, a pulse just below the edge of hearing, but each night it grew stronger. The sensors registered a vibration every 32 seconds, steady as a heartbeat. It came from 40 feet below ground. On the third night, the sound changed. It began to respond. When the wind rose, the hum rose with it. When the air stilled, the hum deepened softer, slower, like a living thing adjusting its breath. Miriam pressed her hand to the ground and felt warmth, not heat, but the warmth of a pulse moving through soil. Her notes from that night still exist. It is not dead history. It is breathing. It remembers the rhythm of creation. At dawn, she found something half buried in the dust. A stone fused smooth on one side, rough on the other, with the imprint of a human hand pressed deep into it. The fingers were splayed, the palm curved slightly inward as if reaching. Around it a spiral. She took it with her. When she set it in sunlight, it vibrated faintly in her palm. No one believed her reports. They called it superstition. They said it was the echo of nearby machinery, geological coincidence, tribal myth. But then other teams came measuring the same vibrations across the plains, all pulsing in perfect synchrony. Something beneath the ground was alive with memory. Then the storms began again. They came without warning, crawling over the horizon like black mountains. Lightning fell in straight lines instead of forks, vertical spears striking the same ground again and again, forming glowing rings of fire. Cameras captured it from miles away, pillars of light connecting earth and sky. The rain fell in spirals circling the same coordinates over and over. When the storms passed, the grass lay scorched in perfect circles, each one the diameter of a long-forgotten lodge. In some, the soil had turned to glass. In others, stones had risen through the ground, forming low mounds where no one had built for centuries. People began to whisper. Farmers plowing at night claimed to hear singing. The hum grew louder before storms deep enough to rattle the windows. Bison long vanished, began to return, their migration patterns curving in wide arcs that matched the ancient circles. The plains were waking, and deep below the rhythm grew stronger. It was the same 32-second pulse, the same heartbeat that Miriam had recorded years before. Scientists turned it into sound. What they heard was unmistakable, a sequence of rhythmic blows like hammers striking wood. Overlaid on top was a faint resonance, almost musical. They called it seismic memory, the earth retaining vibration from repeated patterns of human labor. But the frequencies were too exact, too organized, not random at all. The builder's rhythm had survived. Each year, as storms returned, the pattern expanded. Satellite images showed luminous threads branching between the circular sites, glowing faintly during electrical activity. The lines connected across hundreds of miles, forming a single vast geometry, a structure not above the ground, but within it. And at the center of it all, the old stories said, was the lodge. The Great Lodge, the one that vanished in light a century ago. The night it returned, no one expected it. A storm had been building for days, wind rising like a drum roll, thunder crawling closer. A gathering of descendants, scientists, and elders stood on the plains near the Platte. They came to listen, to measure, to remember. Instruments surrounded them, blinking red and green against the dark. The hum beneath the ground grew louder, so deep it made the ribs vibrate. Then the lightning came, not from the clouds but from below. White pillars burst upward, branching across the sky like veins of light. The air smelled of copper and rain. The sound was everywhere. Not thunder, not wind, but the roaring of thousands of unseen hammers. The ground shook. The vibration turned to rhythm, and as it reached its peak, the light began to take shape. The witnesses saw outlines, faint, transparent, but real, rising from the soil walls, of luminous air-domed roofs, of fire circles, within circles spinning above the grass. It wasn't an illusion. It was a memory forcing itself into the present, a blueprint made of light, the ghost of the Great Lodge, returning to life. The patterns were exact, aligned with the stars overhead, matching the constellation of the Great Lodge in the sky. Lightning struck its perimeter in 12 perfect intervals, each strike punctuating the hum below. And then, for one impossible moment, it all synchronized. The thunder, the vibration, the wind, everything moved as one. The same rhythm that began in 1842, when the first builder lifted his hammer. The sound was not deafening, but immense, a pulse you felt more than heard, like the beating heart of the world. People fell to their knees. Some covered their ears, some reached out their hands as if to touch the air. Cameras recorded nothing but static lenses, fogged batteries drained. Only sound survived, a steady, thunderous breath that lasted exactly 7 minutes. When the light faded, the plains were changed. Where the storm had touched the soil, shimmered. Grass burned black at the edges, but not destroyed, alive, glowing faintly under moonlight. At the center, a shallow depression marked the ground, not random, but circular, its edges smooth as glass. The hum continued for days, soft, constant, like the earth exhaling. Scientists called it a geomagnetic feedback event. The elders called it the land's answer. They said the builders had finally been heard. Months later, when the rains returned, something strange happened. The scorched rings bloomed. Flowers rose from the glassy soil, white blossoms no one could identify. They grew in exact spirals, each petal tinted with metallic sheen. Under ultraviolet light, they reflected patterns identical to the carvings found on the old copper plates. When researchers studied the pollen, they found traces of minerals, copper, iron, calcium, elements not found in plant life. The soil beneath was charged with static humming, faintly. And as they stood there, the wind shifted, carrying a deep, low tone. It was not random, it was the same note from the storm. The builder's song. What followed could not be explained. In the weeks after the storm, seismic monitors across the region recorded low-frequency vibrations, traveling east, moving like a wave beneath the continent. They reached the Mississippi in 3 days, the Appalachians in 5. The pattern pulsed outward, faint but measurable, a heartbeat rippling under the land. It was as though the plains were sending a message to the rest of the continent, a memory waking up after 200 years of silence. And then it stopped. But those who live there still say the wind sounds different now. At night, when the stars burn low and the grass lies silver under the moon, they hear it again, a deep thrum beneath the soil, slow, patient, eternal. Some say it's thunder trapped underground. Others say it's the builders still at work shaping the earth from below. They built their homes in circles so that nothing could end. Even death became continuation. The scientists will call it resonance magnetic anomaly or geomorphic echo. The people who remember will call it what it's always been, the breath of the earth, the heartbeat of creation, the voice of those who chose to build instead of vanish. And when the next storm comes, they will listen. Because somewhere beneath their feet, the builders are still hammering, not to reclaim, but to remind. Not to rise again, but to say they never left. The Great Plains breathe, and every gust carries their song. Each spring, when the lightning returns, the horizon glows once more, faint but steady, like the pulse of something vast and living, stretched between time and eternity. The world forgets. The land never does. And somewhere between thunder and silence, the builders keep building one heartbeat at a time. The storm passed, but the memory of it clung to the land like breath on glass. The plains glistened in silence, vast and washed clean, their horizon drawn sharp as a blade beneath a bruised sky. The rain had stopped, yet the air still trembled, as if the ground itself was trying to exhale centuries of silence. Every blade of grass glittered with a faint sheen that lingered long after the clouds had drifted west, as though 1,000 invisible hands had brushed their fingertips across the earth and left behind the softest trace of light. In that light, nothing looked ordinary anymore. The rivers gleamed with color. They had never known pale blues and greens, twisting like veins beneath the surface. When the wind moved, the reflections did not scatter. They rippled outward in concentric circles, perfectly formed, as if the land had learned geometry again. There were no voices, no machines, no thunder, only the hum, low, patient, unending. It came not from the sky, nor from the wind, but from beneath everything. It was the kind of sound that could be felt, more than heard, steady and soft, like the breathing of something ancient that had finally awakened. The people who lived there felt it first, though they could not say when. Farmers in the early hours stood by their fences' boots, pressed into damp soil, feeling the pulse rise through the soles of their feet. Cattle turned their heads toward the earth and stood motionless for long stretches of time as if listening. Children half asleep began murmuring words no one understood, syllables that carried the rhythm of old chants lost to living memory. A woman near the Niobrara woke one night to the sound of her walls gently vibrating. The pictures on her mantel rattled, but it wasn't the wind. She pressed her ear to the floorboards and swore she heard voices beneath the wood, hundreds, maybe thousands, singing low and slow in a language that didn't belong to any known century. By morning, her story had spread through the valley, and others began to notice it too. The pattern in the way the wind curved around their homes, the way the grass bent not randomly but in spirals, the way the clouds at sunset gathered into perfect rings before dispersing into dusk. Scientists came with instruments and theories. They said the hum was geologic, a vibration caused by shifting aquifers or deep magma flow. But those who remembered the old stories, those whose ancestors had once raised lodges on this same soil, knew better. The land was remembering its builders. Over the next months, the plains began to change. The grass grew thicker, almost luminous in certain places. Patches of long-buried earth rose in gentle mounds, as if the ground was breathing in its sleep. Streams that had vanished in droughts decades earlier reappeared, cutting shallow silver threads through the meadows. In those waters floated fragments of something no one could explain, tiny flecks of fused clay and metal, shimmering in sunlight, shaped like spirals no larger than a fingernail. Under microscopes, they revealed patterns identical to those carved into the builders' stones a century before. But the strangest thing was the timing. Every 32 seconds, the instruments recorded a pulse. Not an earthquake, not machinery, but an electromagnetic tremor traveling across hundreds of miles. It began in the heart of the plains and spread outward in waves. To the trained ear, it wasn't random, it was rhythm. Steady, deliberate, like the slow beating of a heart. The hum could no longer be ignored. It was recorded in laboratories, broadcast across radio frequencies, even captured accidentally in wildlife recordings. Late-night truckers on empty highways said their dashboards vibrated when they drove over certain sections of road. Pilots flying low across the Great Plains said their altimeters flickered with each pulse, as though the air itself expanded and contracted. Some claimed to see faint lines glowing across the land during lightning storms, thin luminous paths tracing invisible circles that linked distant towns, rivers, and burial grounds into a single vast network. And always there was the number 32, the same interval between pulses. The same rhythm the builders had struck when they hammered beams into the earth more than a century ago. As word spread, the land began to draw people again. Descendants of the old tribes came first: Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Pawnee, each bringing fragments of stories passed down in whispers. They came carrying cedar and sweetgrass, copper ornaments, and small carved stones. They did not come to worship, but to listen. Scientists came too, setting up tents and arrays of sensors beside them, unsure whether to study or simply witness. It was the first time in living memory that two ways of knowing the sacred and the scientific stood side by side on the same soil, each aware that the other might be right. At dusk, when the wind dropped and the world fell into stillness, they heard it together. The hum was faint at first, then deepened into resonance, rolling through the ground like thunder beneath water. It was beautiful, terrible, magnetic. Some wept, some fell to their knees. The scientists watched their seismographs go wild, the lines forming patterns that resembled not random noise but sound waves arranged into symmetrical arcs. The elders recognized the pattern instantly. It was the shape of the lodge, the same circle of energy that had guided the builder's hands a century before. That night, the sky answered. Clouds gathered in spirals, forming a vast whirlpool of silver above the plains. Lightning flashed silently, branching downward, but never touching ground. For a moment, the light revealed something extraordinary. Faint outlines rising from the soil walls of mist domes of vapor, a great circular structure glowing like an echo of the vanished Great Lodge. The watchers below stood in stunned silence as the image hung in the air, shifting between solid and spectral, between memory and presence. And then came the rain, not heavy, but warm, falling straight down as though poured from above. It struck the soil and hissed faintly, each drop releasing a note, a vibration, a whisper. The sound rose and fell in cadence with the hum, and for 7 minutes the land itself seemed to sing. No words, no melody, just the low harmony of existence remembering itself. When dawn came, the plains shimmered with a light that had no source. The air was alive, charged. The hum softened, but never disappeared. In the weeks that followed, strange reports continued. Animals gathered in circles before storms. Wildflowers bloomed in patterns matching the old glyphs. Migratory birds changed their routes, tracing spirals above the lodge's resting place. Even the stars seemed to align differently, as if the heavens themselves were bending to acknowledge the rhythm below. People began to build again, not out of necessity, but instinct. The first to rise was a new structure at the heart of the Great Lodge site, a great ring of copper and wood, designed by native architects and guided by oral history rather than blueprints. The workers noticed uncanny coincidences, tools that resonated when placed on the ground beams, that seemed to align themselves, shadows that fell perfectly along the circle's axis at sunrise. Each nail struck echoed faintly, and each echo lingered longer than it should have, merging with the hum that rolled beneath the soil. When the last beam was lifted, the wind stilled completely. The fire lit in its center burned blue before settling to gold, and every person there, scientist, builder, elder, felt their pulse slow until it matched the heartbeat of the earth itself. For the first time in centuries, the lodge was whole again. And then something even more extraordinary happened. The hum stopped, not in silence, but in resolution, like the final note of a song finally finding its home chord. The air became still yet heavy with presence, as if all the sound that had once vibrated through the land had condensed into a single moment of understanding. Those who stood there later said they felt something pass through them, not wind, not energy, but recognition. The land acknowledging its children, and the children recognizing the land as their own reflection.